Hello, I'm Peter King, Reader in Social Thought at De Montfort University in Leicester, and author of Choice and the End of Social Housing, which was published by the IEA in 2006, and I'm also the editor of a special issue of Economic Affairs, the journal of the IEA, which was published in June 2008, again on housing issues, although this time a comparative analysis. I've taught housing for 20 years as well as working in housing, so some experience of social housing and written and thought quite a bit about it. And the monograph Choice and the End of Social Housing is some of my thoughts about the way in which social housing is organised and the way that it ought to be. The government over the last 10 years has brought in many new proposals, most of which are aimed to put people first and to develop what they call the choice agenda. My argument, however, is that despite the rhetoric of choice, what the government has tended to do is centralise provision so it's under the control of central government. And so we have a very tightly circumscribed and controlled system of social housing rather than one that actually does empower people, even though that might be the government's rhetoric. Government has got very ambitious plans for social housing and the way of expressing the idea of choice. But as I say, in reality, what we've seen is a continued decline in the tenure and an increasing centralisation of social housing to ensure that it meets the government's agenda rather than the agenda of local communities. So choice is very much a top-down agenda, that it has been imposed without any consideration of what choice actually means, nor indeed are there any changes in structures that actually give people more concrete choice. The control of resources does not allow for individual decision making. It's still very much at the behest of the landlord, who themselves are very much controlled by central government. So my argument is that social housing has failed as a form of provision for people on low incomes, which is primarily, of course, what social housing is about. What's actually happened is the creation of benefit dependency, where 55% of tenants of working age are dependent on benefits, and there is an increasing problem of economic dependency, of fewer and fewer households where there is a working member, and so a consequent lack of personal responsibility in terms of looking after one's own. Moreover, what compounds that issue is that a majority of the rental income for social landlords derives from housing benefit as well. So not only do we have a situation where the tenants are dependent on housing benefit, but also a situation where social landlords themselves are dependent on housing benefit, so that they tend to maximise tenants who are in receipt of benefit. 2/3 of housing association tenants are now in receipt of benefit. What compounds that problem is the fact that all the benefit is paid direct to the landlord and not to the tenant. So you have a situation where the government is still subsidising the vast majority of tenants, but that money is going directly to landlords without any direct relationship with the tenant. My argument is that social housing, like all forms of housing, is very much amenable to choice, that we can make decisions about the form of provision because our housing need is permanent. We always have a housing need. We're capable of understanding what that housing need is, and that by and large that housing need is predictable. Now that means we're much more capable of choosing rather than other forms of welfare, particularly healthcare, where the needs are much more unpredictable. So we are much more capable of choosing what housing suits us, and that puts us in a stronger position as individuals. Another problem with social housing is that it's what one could term particularist. It's never been intended for the entire population, it's always been aimed at a minority. That creates problems in terms of its political popularity and the desire that people have to become social tenants. So we've seen over the last 30 years an increasing residualisation of ghetto estates, of households increasingly dependent on state handouts, living in these social estates, whereas the majority of households now are owner-occupiers with a completely different relationship to their housing. The main form of subsidy, as I've mentioned, is housing benefit, paid supposedly to individuals, and the basis of the reform proposals that I expounded in my monograph, Choice and the End of Social Housing, was primarily around about extending choice. What I proposed was the effective abolition of social landlords, that instead of having different forms of tenure, we just have one form of rented tenancy, taking away the privileges, the tax privileges, the subsidy privileges that are currently enjoyed by social landlords, and so effectively we privatise social housing so that we have just one tenure and one form of renting, which is private landlords. This would involve ending subsidies to social landlords, making all subsidies payable to the tenant rather than to the landlord. So the only legitimate form of housing subsidy, I argue, is what is currently housing benefit, a housing allowance paid to individuals. An important element of that is that it is actually paid to individuals rather than it being paid direct to the landlord. Any subsidy ought to be paid direct to the tenant, so therefore they are responsible for paying their rent, they manage their own financial affairs and become responsible. That, I would argue, would lead to a fundamental change in the relationship between landlord and tenant, making landlords much more responsive to the needs of their tenants, as well as making tenants more responsible. That, I would argue, is a real agenda for putting people first rather than the centralisation of social housing that we've seen over the last decade.
There are about 4 million social dwellings in the UK. What would happen to them under your proposals?
The glib answer is essentially nothing. Those housing units would still exist. They would still be tenanted by the same sorts of people. So in the short term it would alter very little, and I think the experience that existing tenants would have would be relatively minor. The main change they would experience would be the fact that they would be responsible for paying their own rent, and it would end, as far as the landlord's concerned, any distinction between those tenants on housing benefit and those in employment. So there would effectively be just tenants and landlords. The fundamental change would be towards the way that landlords have to behave rather than the way in which tenants do. So it's a bit of a misnomer, if you like, to argue that anything would fundamentally change. The houses would not cease to exist because they stop being social housing units.
What should government's role be with regards to housing reform?
My argument is that instead of government trying to provide housing in the form of social housing and providing direct subsidies, what we should be looking for is a situation where government facilitates the provision of housing, both through providing subsidies to people on low income in the form of housing benefits, personal subsidies, but also through its use of planning mechanisms. The government has a planning role, which, whilst clearly should be under democratic control, that is something I think which government can positively do. So planning and facilitating rather than direct provision is what I would argue for.